I like Elden Ring a lot. From Software tried a lot of things with the open world approach, and for a first attempt they got a surprising amount of things right. But ultimately, I don't think it was worth it. The open world often gets in the way of the actually incredible aspects of the game, and it brought a lot of content that is really boring to me. I don't need a game to keep me company for 100 hours. I'd rather take 50 if the quality is consistently good. This video assumes that you have already played the game or you don't care about spoilers. For one of my early points, I will need to use footage of some late game boss fights, so I figured I'd give you this warning. I've structured this video into 4 parts: mechanics, open world, boss fights and miscellaneous topics. You can use the YouTube chapter function if you'd like to watch in chunks. Let's start with some positive points. I think the combat mechanics are some of the best they've ever made. They took bits and pieces of all of their previous games and they work really well together. From Dark Souls 1, they took the way poise works and mixed in a little bit of hyper armor. Wearing heavy armor will allow you to withstand the stagger of an attack. And thankfully, poise is not as ridiculous as it used to be in DS1. You can't face tank enemies and just spam buttons. But it still allows you to shrug off an attack, which can be really helpful in a fight. Especially when you want to trade a hit, which is where the hyper armor also comes in. Attacks on bigger weapons will make you less likely to get interrupted. It is essentially additional poise during the animation, which allows you to make a trade beyond what your armor should normally allow. Smaller weapons can also get hyper armor with specific Ashes of War. You can use that to trade with a boss. Like in this example, where I have complete starting gear with 12 poise, but my greatsword charged attacks still allow me to trade with Margit. Incredibly useful. I think Elden Ring might have the best version of this mechanic. There are only 2 issues I see. The poise values of armor sets could use some rebalancing. There are some that completely overshadow the others with the amount they give for their weight, which limits your viable options if you want to play a poise heavy character. And also, the really big benefits kick in after reaching 51 poise, and about 80% of armor sets are way below that value. The other thing relates to hyper armor. It is additional poise, but it also halves the poise of your armor during the animation. This can lead to some combinations of weapons and armors where you are able to withstand a stagger in neutral thanks to your armor's poise, but as soon as you swing, you actually have less poise and then lose the trade. Pretty dumb, and doesn't feel intentional. It should just be additional poise without halving. From Dark Souls 2 they took power stancing, which means dual wielding 2 weapons. This time the mechanic is a whole lot simpler. In Dark Souls 2 you could combine weapons between different weapon types, and depending on the combination, one type would determine the moveset you'll get. In Elden Ring you can only combine weapons of the same type, which is perfectly fine in my opinion. Whenever I used that mechanic before, I stuck to one weapon type anyways. In most cases I even picked the exact same weapon twice, because I thought it looked the best. The implementation in Elden Ring is good, and I'm very happy that power stancing is finally back. From Bloodborne they took the cute hand lantern and also running heavy attacks. I always like those. Typically one of your running attacks is for a single target and the other is a sweep to run into a group. In Elden Ring it is basically the same, and I had quite a lot of fun with them in the early game. But soon I realized that the new jump attacks completely outclass running heavy attacks on most weapons. Very similar animation with about the same recovery, but just more damage and stagger. Jump attacks are pretty much your best opener whenever you run back to a boss. The jump starts with a lot of forward momentum, so you can initiate the attack from further away. In other words, you can capitalize on your opening earlier. The low recovery at the end also means that you can often continue your punish with more light attacks if the opening allows it. The lower part of your hurt box gets disabled during the jump. Combined with the vertical movement, this means that you can jump over most shockwaves or area of effect attacks. It still requires some timing, just like a dodge, as you want to be at the apex of your jump when the shockwave hitbox is active. But I found a lot of attacks that are actually easier to jump over than to dodge through. And since you can go right into a punish with the jump attack, it's a very strong combat option. What also makes them really good is that they build up to a stance break. And stance breaks are amazing. Attacks fill up a hidden stance bar. Once full, the enemy will open up to riposte. After playing this game for a while, you can get a feel for how exactly this works. It's very noticeable that it works like a status bar. where the stance recovers over time, which means that you have to play aggressive to force the riposte. I think stance breaks are genius. Boss fights that have very oppressive movesets with little openings also all have a very easy to break stance. After a riposte, the boss gets up slowly, which is enough time to get a fully or half charged attack off. This is some of the highest stance damage you can deal, and it's very easy to see how this can lead to a snowballing effect where you are dominating the boss. Get that first riposte, charge the attack, and then you don't let the boss recover. Keep the pressure on them and force another break. Bloodborne had the rally system to reward aggression, Elden Ring has stance breaks. You need to play aggressive, but not reckless. Find your openings and try sticking to the boss as much as possible. Only back off when you really need it. Stance breaks give a lot of your combat options meaning. Typically, light attack chains are your best DPS option in these games. That's also true for most basic weapons in Elden Ring, but they are not your highest stance damage per second. Charged attacks, jump attacks, Ashes of War and shield counters are where you really get your stance damage. It also gives poise a lot of meaning in this game. You shouldn't think of hit trading as a mistake on your part. Get a beefy armor set or one of the weapon types with hyper armor. Their charged attacks have a lot of additional poise, so trade with those. The trade might not seem worth it if you only compare the damage you dealt to the amount you received. But if you consider the riposte, the additional charged attack after, and the snowballing this can lead to, then one good trade might be all you need to completely change the fight around. It's crazy how much the combat changes once you start playing around the stance breaks. You shouldn't play this like the my turn, your turn type of combat that previous games often had. Play aggressive and fast, and then make your own openings. It's my favorite new combat mechanic. I also want to talk about guard counters, because Elden Ring is the first game since Dark Souls 1 where I wanted to use a shield again. The counters deal a ton of damage, and even more stance damage than jump attacks. The best way to use them is to predict the last attack in an enemy's combo and block that one on purpose, so that you can instantly punish with a counter. It's almost like a guard point for Monster Hunter. This way of using shields aggressively is so much fun. It really rewards your knowledge of an enemy's moveset. And as you know, shields are the best when they don't engender passivity. Ashes of War are a fantastic addition to the game. They are special attacks that you can swap out on basic weapons. I love trying all of them out, and being able to customize some part of my moveset. What I really wanted on my weapon was some form of gap closing attack, and so the double slash Ash of War became my favorite in the game. You step forward with 2 quick slashes, which is a great extension of your combo to catch an approaching enemy or finish one that is trying to get away from you. The follow-up to that is 3 more quick slashes that deal very high damage, and are great for building up a status effect. It became my preferred damage option whenever I had a large enough opening. You can swap ashes out at any side of grace for free, which is very good. There once were some enemies that had their head as a weak spot, and so I swapped to an ash that could hit clean vertical hits to better snipe the weak spot. Situations like this added a lot to my enjoyment of the combat system, and this amount of experimentation is great for the replay value. What I also really like is that light attack chains now have a finisher with a lot of recovery, whereas previously you could chain them as much as your stamina allowed. Careless light attack spam is now punished. You have to use more of your toolset. Like the Ashes of War. You can use them right before the last attack in your chain that would leave you in recovery. A very good change. The combat mechanics of Elden Ring are incredibly good. It's one of my favorite aspects of the game. Something related to the combat mechanics that I also want to talk about is the input buffering in Elden Ring. It has some problems. Compared to previous games, the way you two-hand your weapon has changed. Before it was a single input, triangle for PlayStation buttons. In Elden Ring it's a combination of 2 inputs, triangle plus R1. But the input queue didn't get the memo, because the triangle input will be dropped if you buffer it during an animation. You will do a normal attack instead. A lot of actions like parrying an attack and two-handing for the riposte, or finishing an enemy with your faster offhand weapon are a lot more clunky than they should be. You have to remember that the game works like this and wait with your input until your animations are done, and you return to neutral. The bigger issue with input buffering comes with dodging and staggers. A lot of enemies have delayed attacks to roll catch you if you panic. On its own I like this change. Roll spamming is punished, when it was pretty effective in previous games. But what can happen with the input buffering is that you time your dodge too late, you get hit and staggered, and then the dodge input gets carried out, so you dodge into the roll catch attack. You made one mistake, but the input queue turns it into two mistakes. Completely removing input buffering would be a no-go. That would feel horrible. Imagine if you always had to press attack at the exact frame when your animation is done. One frame too early and nothing happens. There would be thousands of moments where you want to do an attack after a dodge, but then your character just stands there and you wonder what went wrong. Button mashing would be encouraged without a queue, so that you can get actions off as soon as possible. I think what should be done is that any stagger animation clears the queue. It's a hard reset. I can't really think of any situations where you'd want your input to still come out after a stagger. Trading a hit with poise would still work, because there is no stagger to begin with. It should reset with stagger specifically and not damage in general, because any small fly clearing your inputs would probably loop around to feeling clunky again. I think the input buffering actually worked like this in the earlier games. Try as I might, but I couldn't replicate the issue in those games. But in Dark Souls 3 and Elden Ring, it's very consistent if you do it on purpose. In the grand scheme of things, it's not the worst issue. Across my time with the game, I can recall maybe 5 moments where it caused an extra hit. But input buffering is one of those things you might not consciously think about while playing, but it contributes a lot to how smooth the gameplay feels. And in the past, From Software has used input buffering really well, I'd say. The input buffering in Elden Ring is something that could most likely be fixed with one patch. To me it seems like a bug, and not intentional. The next thing I want to talk about is the horse. In terms of movement, this is probably my favorite form of horse riding in any game. Because it doesn't feel like you're riding a horse. It feels like the player character, but you just have more movement speed and a double jump. Acceleration is almost instant, and stopping happens very fast too. When you are standing still and want to turn, it takes a moment. But otherwise it's all very fast and snappy. I don't care that much about it being realistic horse riding. I care more about something feeling good to play, which it does. I especially like the aerial control of the horse. You can correct your course with the double jump into any direction, which made me use the horse each time I could for platforming. There is also horseback combat, and I think it's okay. It took me a long while to get used to it, but once I did, it was pretty enjoyable for crowds of enemies. Learning when to make a full stop or only slightly moving the stick to not overshoot the enemy. Using the jump and sprint while chaining attacks on your left and right side between the enemies. That's very fun. But for bigger enemies and boss fights, the combat becomes very dull after a while. Prime example would be the dragons. You fight many of those. And for most of the time, you just chip at their ankles until they stomp with that foot. And then you go for the other ankle. They can mix it up with breath attacks, bites or tail swipes, but for the most part they will use attacks to get you off the body part you are attacking. So stomping it is. The only way to get invincibility frames with the horse is getting on or off it. But you have to come to a full stop for that. The jump doesn't protect you. Coming to a full stop each time you want to dodge something is pretty slow, awkward and dangerous. Any attack that needs iframes to be dodged is best handled while being on foot. So any boss that didn't need iframes was kinda easy and dull, and for everything else I didn't want to use the horse. I think having easier access to iframes could give horseback combat some much needed depth. A tap of the dodge button could do a short hop with iframes, and holding it would lead to a sprint. Exactly how it works with your character. I also think that having hold to sprint would be better than the current version of having to spam dodge every few seconds if you want to go somewhere fast. Which you probably will, because the game world is huge. Now we get to the big one. The game is open world. And From Software is absolutely killing it with the environments. There's so much variety in them. Limgrave has pretty standard fields and forests, but I like those. Weeping Peninsula is even better, with deeper forests inside a valley that you have to traverse with a hanging bridge. Liurnia has the best view in the game, with multiple giant structures in the distance all drawing your attention. I really like the half-sunken city. Caelid is disgusting, and really good. I love climbing up the Divine Tower and then platforming down inside it. The game is willing to just go completely overboard with its size, which I enjoyed for the structures and more linear parts of the game. I like that most of the open world is segmented into plateaus. It's cool visually, and I think it also helps the exploration. Open world games can often get overwhelming if it's just this vast open stretch of land, but in Elden Ring I never really felt that. You can take it one segment at a time. It makes the exploration very bite-sized. At times, it also allows the world to have something close to a linear level design through the plateaus. A cliff might be too high to jump down from, so you are funneled into the canyon where a specific encounter is planned out. You might see some place, but you just can't figure out how to get there, despite having a lot of freedom with your horse. These moments are great. My only wish would be to have more of them. There are only a handful of moments where the segmented world is used this way. What I also want to highlight is the map, like the actual in-game one you can open. It is fantastic. There are pretty much no UI elements like question marks to point you towards interesting locations. The map looks like a fantasy map, and the important locations just naturally draw your attention. It doesn't feel like you're just finishing a checklist of places. Very good. The open world also gives the game really good replay value. This is an aspect I've always enjoyed in previous games, coming up with new builds and planning out a route depending on which items I need. I'm making an ogre, so I start with the master key and rush to Blighttown for the club. The open world makes this part of the game better than ever before. The order in which you do the content can be all over the place. So much can be skipped early on. Or there are alternative paths to go somewhere, and the character you want to play influences these choices, once you know where all the good things are. A mage might set out for Liurnia first to get all the spells and memory stones. My second character was Spyro, because I wanted to use the dragon incantations. So Caelid it was, to get a bunch of dragon hearts. Doing things a little different each time added a lot to my enjoyment of the game. And I always had the most enjoyment while exploring when I was inside one of the legacy dungeons. Stormvale Castle is an amazing level. There are so many paths to go. Every time I replayed the game, I still managed to see something new I could jump over. With the addition of the jump button, they really managed to give that sense of scale. And by the end, I felt like I fully explored an entire castle, while previous games only ever gave me a slice of it. If only one thing sticks around for future games, then it has to be the jump button. It makes the exploration really enjoyable. I imagine the other games will now feel like you're on rails when you play them after Elden Ring. Lanedale is even better at making use of the jump button. It's my favorite area in the game. There are hundreds of paths to go. The normal way through the buildings, over the railing and onto the roofs, down into the destroyed lower parts of the city, the sewer system, the upper part of the city which you reach by scaling the wing of a giant dragon. That last one was my favorite part of Lanedale. I think the city will go down as one of the greatest levels From Software has ever made. But in these moments where the exploration is so enjoyable, it is very easy to forget that the game is even open world. It's cool that the legacy dungeons exist within the context of the open world, but the area itself could have also been in a game that is more linear. Give it a jump button and there you go. I really wanted Elden Ring to have more legacy dungeons and less open world, because it brought a lot of problems with it. Balancing is the main one. Because you can do the different areas out of order, you are bound to have many moments where you can just steamroll the enemies and bosses without much of a challenge. To give them some credit, this was very likely to happen with an open world game. And this issue can be lessened by the great replay value the game has. You can prioritize the areas which you steamrolled on your first run. This actually helped a lot. Morgoth became one of my favorite fights on my second run. On my first I thought, it's just Margit, but his stick has a different color. But the first time experience for areas and boss fights is very special. Crushing a main story boss that is hyped up in a cutscene doesn't feel very special to me. And on your next playthrough, you'd naturally be better at the game, so you can crush the boss for a different reason then. I don't know if there is a good solution to the balancing issues. I'm not a fan of level scaling. That's how open world games usually do it. It makes the world feel very artificial, if the same rat you saw 10 hours ago can suddenly withstand your giant sword. It also feels like you're getting punished for exploring. Even the current version of the game, where you can destroy a bunch of areas, is preferable to me. This is something that the other games have over Elden Ring. By not being open world, the devs were able to better design the challenges and boss fights around the level of the player, and the type of gear they currently have access to. You were still able to do things out of order, but it never got so out of hand like in Elden Ring. Over-leveling in previous games was a good way of reducing the difficulty. You had to go out of your way to do it, and it was also pretty boring. But if you're struggling to the point where you're not having fun, then go for it. In Elden Ring, over-leveling just happens by playing the game. Not cashing in on level ups or weapon upgrades to handle the balancing yourself is also a pretty awkward solution. Because then you start doing the stance of thinking, is there something I can overcome or should I upgrade now? Will the content I want to do afterwards withstand this upgrade? Should I be reading a guide? The best solution to the balancing issue would be to repopulate the world with stronger versions of enemies, including the areas you haven't gotten to yet. You can't really do that for the main boss fights, but at least the areas would pose a challenge. You could tie it to some big story event to clearly communicate what's happening, and to fit a game mechanic into the world, which From Software has always been excellent at. It could be very organic, and make the world feel more alive if it is changing. But this would be asking a tremendous amount of extra work from the devs. And I think the game already suffers from being too ambitious, so lots of areas didn't get the care they needed. With a smaller game, that might have been possible. Next issue of the open world. Compared to previous games, I think Elden Ring has the largest amount of boring content. The world is huge. Overall, the game has a ton of enemies and bosses. But relative to the size of the game, the enemy variety is still pretty low. Recycling content is not a bad thing. Almost every game does it. Picture the first area of Dark Souls 1. Now imagine if your standard was 100% unique content. So every hollow would have to be a unique model with a unique moveset. We'd be lucky to get 4-hour games by most companies. But the thing with Elden Ring is for one the amount of recycling it had to do to fill the game world, and that Elden Ring tends to recycle content that wasn't even fun in the first place. Erdtree avatars are really boring, and they are everywhere. Within my first playthrough, I fought so many of those that I could consistently kill them without taking a single hit. I could just turn my brain off and go through the motions. And the sad thing is that they are tied to very important items, so you can't really ignore them. The same goes for the ulcerated tree spirits. Those drop golden seeds to have more healing flasks available, and they are horrible to fight. They are always thrashing around and tend to be placed in arenas that are way too small for their size, so they clip through walls and you can forget using the lock on camera. Even in the open world, they are a visual mess to fight. And despite not being able to see their telegraphs clearly, they are still incredibly easy in my opinion. They are way too big, so you can hug their body and just mash buttons to empty your stamina bar on them. Rune bears, revenants, dragons, Erdtree avatars and the tree noodles, trolls, marionette soldiers, demi-humans, skeletons, fanged imps. Elden Ring has many enemies I got tired of fighting within my first playthrough, which I never felt in any of the previous games. It feels like filler. Speaking of filling things in, the game really drops the ball with enemy variety in the late game areas. Mountaintop of Giants is just calet with snow. I don't think there's a single new enemy type to fight here. Only the consecrated snowfield has one new enemy with the archers riding wolves. I think this is the part of the game where most players will just mentally check out and skip to the next boss with the horse. Fighting all of these birds, dogs, trolls and hands all over again with just increased numbers is not a fun time. I think the Halig tree suffers the most from the late game areas feeling pretty rushed. Visually, it's my favorite area in the game. I love treehouse villages, and later on the Brace also looks amazing. But gameplay wise, this area is bad. Every enemy is something you fought before. There are 20 basic knights copy-pasted everywhere. Excuse me guys, is this the way to the ancient dragon? There are 2 Erdtree avatars, and an ulcerated tree spirit inside a pool of scarlet rot. Thankfully, only one avatar is on the main path. But its placement is so bad because it can get stuck inside the tunnel it is guarding, and will then just spam the seeking projectiles attack so you can't even approach it. This area could have been a really cool optional level. But sadly, it falls into the type of area in these games where I fought all the enemies on my first playthrough, but for every future one I just think, nah, I'm good. I just skip past everything because I want to get to the really fun and engaging boss fight at the end. I think the world should have been significantly smaller so that every area and boss could have gotten the time they needed. They had to stuff this game full of so much filler, which becomes even more apparent once you start going underground. I think the caves, catacombs and mines are pretty bad in Elden Ring. It doesn't take long before you start seeing the same Lego bricks they are made out of. The enemy and boss variety is also at its lowest point here. Now there are some exceptions for the environments, like the Crystal Cave, Frozen Ice Cave and the Waterfall Cave. Those are great and were very enjoyable to explore. There were also some fun puzzles in a few dungeons. Using the blades as an elevator, chasing an enemy back to a light so you can kill it, and I also enjoyed the chariots, for the first 2 times. But the vast majority of dungeons have the same design and very similar layouts. I would trade 5 of the boring ones for one with a good design or gimmick. I also think the exceptions only apply to environments and puzzles. As far as dungeon boss fights go, there is actually not a single one I like. Maybe some dungeons could have ended with an enemy gauntlet instead. Right now it's always a boss 100% of the time. The game already likes to throw basic enemies with a boss health bar at you, so why not have waves of smaller enemies to mix it up a little? I think my time with the game would have been improved if I simply did none of the dungeons. The feeling of quantity over quality is very strong here. That's another reason why I think the game is very good on repeat playthroughs. I now have the knowledge that I shouldn't bother. Just grab the fast travel point and dip. But for a first playthrough that's also not perfect, because of the rewards. You'd miss out on so many weapons and armor pieces. Some of my favorites actually come from dungeons. And there are essential things like the golden seeds, smithing stones, and the bell bearings to buy smithing stones. The upgrade path for non-somber weapons is already pretty rough, with the amount of stuff it requires. And if you also happen to miss one of the bell bearings, then it really hurts your ability to try out new weapons. The game also encourages having more than one weapon. Weaknesses to certain damage types have always been a thing, but previously it was like a slap on the wrist if you didn't match it. But now in Elden Ring, you really feel it. Fighting something made of stone with a sharp or piercing weapon is incredibly slow, to the point where even an unupgraded strike weapon could outdamage it. I think the bell bearings for smithing stones should honestly all be on the main path like the later two are. As the game is right now, you kinda have to do a bunch of dungeons to not miss out on the important rewards. The way I see it, there are 4 ways of handling the dungeons in the game. 1. Do every single one you find, which will most likely lead to a lot of burnout. 2. Do some, which is a gamble if you'll pick the good ones. 3. Do none, which leaves you without the important items and also pretty underleveled for the last stretch of the game. Or 4. You read the wiki. And I think number 4 is the winner. The surprise of finding something good is getting spoiled. But there's no burnout, no waste of time, and always good rewards. I don't like that. My initial playthrough of these games has always been as blind as possible, which I always enjoyed, and I never really cared about all the questlines I messed up or optional areas I missed. Those are for future playthroughs. But Elden Ring is the first one where in hindsight I wish I was working more with the wiki, so that I could know which content I should miss. With this being an open world game, there's a larger focus on exploration. If you find a dungeon at the side of a mountain, you obviously want to know what's inside. And if the answer to that is a place you feel like you've been to 5 times already, with enemies you are tired of fighting, then the exploration takes a big hit. Especially if it keeps happening over such a long playthrough. I wish there was a version of this game where a lot of the open world fat was trimmed. But continuing with the dungeon rewards, I think the pacing of them is also pretty bad. It's very backloaded. An experience which seems to be quite common is that 20 hours into the game I was still running around with my starting armor and weapon, and I was tired of both. The early dungeons are really stingy with their rewards. Usually 1 spirit ash at the end, maybe a talisman if you're lucky. And near the end you get absolutely showered with new items. I still remember one of the later dungeons had a room with 2 full armor sets in it, and all I could think was, where were you 30 hours ago? In the previous games, I always felt like I could kickstart my character much quicker. 3 hours in, and I'm already making meaningful decisions for my build. In Elden Ring, I got nothing to work with. Now in reality, you can actually jumpstart an Elden Ring build much quicker than ever before. The world is very open, and the horse allows you to skip past everything. You can get so many items for your character, without even fighting a single boss. But I'm only talking about the new player experience here. And the dungeons in Limgrave, Weeping Peninsula, and even Caelid give out a low amount of rewards, while Mount Gelmir and Altus Plateau throw things at you left and right. Liurnia has a very good distribution of rewards for its size, I'd say. A lot of stuff should be moved to the earlier parts, while the player is still the most willing to experiment with the different options. I can also think of a more drastic change to the rewards. Let me start with a question. Do you enjoy grinding for weapons and armors in these games? I don't. It is something that has always felt a bit out of place to me. Resting at a checkpoint and then fighting the same enemy for upwards of an hour. Bloodborne did it much better by having all the gear in the world and buyable from shops. I didn't really miss it in that game. If we were to remove the random drops of gear in Elden Ring, then suddenly we have a mountain of stuff we could put as rewards for engaging with the open world. I think it is reasonable to assume that more players would explore a mine they found instead of putting on their farming pants and grinding an enemy. It wouldn't fix the issue of dungeons not having worthwhile designs, enemies and bosses. But then the player could go, yeah, that was kinda lame, but at least I look cool now. Another important topic that relates to the open world is the feeling of adventure. You'd think that Elden Ring would be the best in this regard. Going open world could make the game a grand adventure. But for me at least, Dark Souls 1 still has the best world and feeling of adventure. Part of that is the amount of enemy recycling and boring dungeons, which really killed my drive to explore after a while. But there is another key thing which the exploration is lacking: struggle. One way for me to get a feeling of adventure is to have some kind of hardship in traversing the land. It is especially important to me when the main or only way of interacting with the game world is combat. If there are other qualities like traveling companions, preparation for a journey, climate that needs specific tools, or villages of NPCs, then the game can get away without struggle. If there's only fighting, then better make the areas and general traversal of the world challenging, so that every new location you find feels earned. Dark Souls 1 only had fast travel unlocked at the halfway point, and the game was willing to just be a complete asshole to the players at times. And it was all from the environments. Blighttown is a horrible place to be, and I love it. The constant fear of falling down somewhere, becoming afflicted with poison or worse toxin, all made me very uneasy to be here. When you finally make it to the bottom, activate a bonfire and then realize, oh god, I will respawn down here. What have I done? Or have you ever gotten stuck in the bone zone? This area is really hard to navigate. So most players had a fun time of running aimlessly through catacombs, getting ganked by skeletons and pushed down various falls. And Patches made your life even harder by flipping one of the bridges once you've crossed it. He has kinda become this comic relief character in the later games.
You hunted down Tragoth? Are you certain?
It's like, oh, you kicked me down here, but the promised treasure is actually pretty decent, and I can just fast travel back up. You little rascal. In Dark Souls 1 he was horrible. It is the only game where I strongly considered killing an NPC, because of what they did to me. And I don't know what that says about me, but I really enjoyed getting stuck in the bone zone. Finally getting out of it and seeing light for the first time in hours is something I'll never forget. I became very familiar with the layout of this area, and overcame the struggle the world has presented me with. The world being interconnected works perfectly with the struggles presented by it. The feeling of coming out of the catacombs or Blighttown and looping back to Firelink Shrine with its music wouldn't be so sweet if there was no struggle. And that's a quality that still somewhat persists on repeat playthroughs. Dark Souls 1 has a really good adventure feeling to it. I don't think Elden Ring's world is really capable of recreating that feeling of struggle. The closest would be activating the trap chest in the Dragonburnt ruins and then ending up in Caelid, which is a surprisingly good moment. It might be my favorite in the open world. It's between that or scaling the Divine Tower in Caelid. But the moment with the trap chest still shows a lot of restraint. The path to the next checkpoint isn't that long, and when you finally step out of the mine and see all the horrors of this land, it's like, oh no, anyway. On my first playthrough I had enough self-discipline to not just fast travel out. But still, the feeling that I had the option if things got too tough left me just being mildly scared of this place. But I also don't think there are any changes you could make to Elden Ring to give that same feeling. Removing fast travel or locking it behind a certain point of progression is not good. That would be tedious, and also doesn't give that same feeling of hardship while traversing the land, because you still have your horse to skip past anything dangerous. Remove the horse and we could measure the time spent holding forward in hours across a playthrough. Imagine the Dark Souls 2 frigid outskirts spread across a 100-hour game. The only solution would be to just not have an open world game, which I don't think is reasonable for me to ask. It clearly has its appeal. I just have to take one for the team on this one and hope that future game worlds are more to my liking. I still think something could have been done to the legacy dungeons though. As far as dangerous environments and the world fighting against you goes, Elden Ring is very tame. But the weird thing is that the game doesn't shy away from making the player struggle in general. I mean, have you seen the late game boss fights? But I think it's only restricted to boss fights for some reason. I can't think of any stretch in Elden Ring where I felt relief when I finally came across a site of grace. They are placed everywhere. You only need to fight like 10 enemies before finding a new one. You could cut the number down significantly to make the legacy dungeons more difficult and satisfying. I would also like some traps and difficult to navigate areas. Sen's Funhouse is an incredible level in Dark Souls 1, and I'm tired of pretending it's not. Constantly avoiding the boulders, narrow walkways that limit your ability to dodge, swinging blades to knock you off with enemies placed in strategic places. That area of the game wants you dead, which makes every shortcut or bonfire feel like an incredible achievement. In Elden Ring, I think there's only a focus on making the combat difficult, but not the environment. The most we have in Legacy Dungeons is that one ball in the academy, and ants pushing you off the Halig tree maybe. The chariots in the dungeons were fun, for the first 2 times. Something like that could be good for the main content. I also don't get why the jump button is only really used to jump down shafts when it comes to platforming. Why are there no spinning saws that you have to hop over? Or small platforms that you have to jump to with an enemy to fight? The Volcano Manor would be the perfect place for this sort of stuff. It's basically designed to keep everyone away from getting to Rykard. Why not put a bunch of traps and difficult stretches between checkpoints? One of the only ways you can interact with Elden Ring's world is combat. So the lack of struggle was really disappointing to me. I don't get much of an adventure feeling if everything is so soft. And just to clarify, I'm only missing tough stretches between checkpoints, not between the checkpoint and the boss. Stakes of Paprika are a fantastic addition. I personally think there could be one before every single boss room. The best thing Elden Ring's world has going for it are visuals, which admittedly hit pretty damn hard. But overcoming struggles is a big appeal of these games for me. And Elden Ring only really manages to do that with some boss fights. Next I'll talk about the boss fights. I want to spend a fair bit of time here, going through many examples. It is the largest section of the video by far, because boss fights are my favorite aspect of the later From Software games. I enjoy the worlds and carefully crafted levels a lot, but each time it is the boss fights where I get the most enjoyment. And Elden Ring has some really great boss fights. But the overall quality is still surprisingly average, even when you disregard all the dungeon and field bosses. It has very high highs and very low lows. 60 hours into my first playthrough, I fought back on all the bosses I fought so far, and came to the shocking realization that I only really enjoyed 2 of them. And my favorite fight after all this time with the game was still Margit. For a first boss, he is insane. Without a doubt, the hardest first boss of any From Software game. Now this is most likely the game telling you to go explore more. Some early weapon upgrades and a few levels can go a long way. But I can be stubborn, and so I beat him with my Scimitars +1 and around level 15 or so. And I had a blast. Margit's moveset is probably the best teacher for stance breaks. If you fight him like a typical Dark Souls boss where you only punish with light attacks, then you are gonna have a hard time. But so many of his attacks have large enough recovery to get fully charged attacks off during the fight. And suddenly, the guy that kept styling on you with endless combos isn't so bad anymore. You need to find your openings, commit to the ones which he can't extend with his golden dagger, and then pressure his stance. If you get the charged attack after a riposte, then you can break his stance again with as little as 3 jump attacks of a small weapon. His stance bar is tiny. Here's a tip for identifying the combo extensions he can do. Watch his left hand. 2 out of 4 of his fake recovery openings are telegraphed by him raising his left hand with an open claw. The one you really have to look out for is the single downward slash where he spins his cane around himself and has his left hand behind his back. That's the only one that's pretty hard to figure out, but just look for the spinning startup. The other one is the attack with 2 gold sword slashes followed by a cane poke. He can also extend it without raising his hand, but that attack is easy to tell apart from the rest of his moveset. 2 gold, 1 cane. I'd prefer it if all extensions had that hand telegraph. The crazy mix-ups could be reserved for Morgoth later. Something else Margit and most Elden Ring bosses like to do is roll catching and punishing panic rolls. If you get hit by their combo, then there's often a last attack that catches you outside of your iframes if you try dodging right as the stagger animation finishes. I enjoy it. In Dark Souls 3, I felt that there are barely any bosses which are equipped to deal with your dodge roll. The recovery between rolls, the iframes, speed of the animation, and the stamina cost of them all make it pretty safe to mash the button and get away with it. Elden Ring is punishing that. You need to stop panicking, and watch the boss closely for the moment when you actually need the iframes. And the fact that they had a boss teach you that this early made me very excited for the other boss fights in the game. But I think Elden Ring has a pretty weak early and mid game as far as boss fights go. Godric is still cool though. I think he's a lot easier than Margit, but that's fine. The moveset is still enjoyable. He is probably the closest to a traditional Dark Souls boss. He doesn't really have any roll catching combos. Doesn't punish you if you heal in the open. Very clear openings. But you can practice jumping over AoE attacks with Godric, which can really help for some of the later fights. From a gameplay standpoint, it's odd to not have this as the first boss. Margit's moveset is closer to a DLC boss of previous games. But from a story standpoint, swapping the two around wouldn't make sense, so that's probably why. In Liurnia, the Red Wolf of Radagon is nothing more than a basic enemy. It has absolutely no health. Even a +2 weapon will crush it. The moveset is kinda decent, but you really don't get to see much of it. All it needs is more health to be a good early boss. And the final boss, Renala, is okay. The first phase is a pretty decent gimmick fight. I like chasing after the singing based on sound, and the students floating around, it's good atmosphere. It might not be the height of gameplay, but at least it's memorable. But the second phase I don't think is good. Love the music, the arena, and even her moveset is cool. But for some reason they decided to give her 0 poise. It doesn't matter that you can summon giants, dragons, and even a moon to crash down on me, if I can just interrupt all other attacks you have. Any amount of aggression just invalidates her moveset. Going in under-leveled doesn't change it either, because stagger potential is independent from level ups and weapon upgrades. Only the weapon class and attacks used matter, and even the light attack of a straight sword can interrupt her. I think she really needs more poise. Under no circumstances should you be able to stunlock a major boss fight in the game for half the duration of the fight. I am not too big of a fan of Radahn either, which is sad, because I really like the build-up and spectacle of the fight. With the empty castle, music, and the fact that taking him down is considered a festival in this world, with people gathering from all corners of the land just to honor him with a fight. But the fight itself is pretty awkward in my opinion. I am not sure if you're meant to fight him on horseback for the entire duration of the fight, but his attacks don't seem well matched to the lower hurt box of the player character. Fighting him up close with melee has a lot of attacks simply pass above you. And because of his large size, there are a lot of situations where he's hunched over you and you can't rely on the lock-on camera anymore. But you also don't really need to see what he is doing. I often found myself just wailing on him while he keeps whiffing his attacks. It's also very easy to slip past his attacks and then staying on his back. He turns like a tank. Plus, he has 3 separate phase switch moves that leave him wide open, so you can just unload your damage on him. Fighting him on horseback is also awkward because you're fighting him with horseback combat. I don't think he was particularly challenging or fun. Hang on. I just received a letter that he has been nerfed. I think they really did him dirty with the 1.03 update. Among other things, they reduced the size of his melee hitboxes. I'm still scratching my head about that one. What I said about Radahn having trouble hitting you is now more true than ever. The damage on some of his attacks was reduced. In particular, the damage of his 4 floating meteors in the second phase, which is one part of the nerf I am on board with. Before the update, the meteors would deal multiple instances of damage. I've never seen anyone survive a hit from them. The attack already had a lot going for it. There are 4 meteors coming at you at different timings, while Radahn is also charging at you with another attack. The meteors being able to one-shot you on top of that went too far. Now the attack is in a pretty good state, I'd say. The other part I like is the reduced speed of his gravity arrows at the start of the fight. Now you can avoid them by speeding to the side on your horse, whereas before you needed cover or iframes. I got tired of the arrow phase pretty quickly. But now that you can use the horse against the gravity arrows, you can start the fight much quicker. But I really don't like the rest of the nerf. I thought this whole fight was about putting Radahn out of his misery, but I guess From Software did that for us. Previously, I thought he was an okay boss fight, but now I think he is below average. I can't even consider engaging with the whole festival part of the fight. The poor guy already has enough trouble hitting a single target. They should really adjust the tracking of some of his attacks, and revert the melee hitbox change. Or maybe just make him smaller overall. Just like the open world, Radahn is too big for his own good. With a smaller size, he would have less trouble fighting you. But now we get to the second boss I really enjoyed in the early and mid game, Elamir of the Briar. It has one of the strangest movesets of any knight in armor type of boss. It's really good at controlling the fight. Up close, the melee combos have very unusual timings. They're not overly fast, but can easily trick you if you panic. If you have some distance, then it starts mind controlling the greatsword. For the first few attempts, I had no idea how to read these attacks. The sword just seemed like it could go anywhere at any time, sometimes even appearing from behind you. But the more I threw myself against the boss, the easier it became to read. It doesn't have that many variations of the mind control combos, and once you've seen the start of it, you could know how the rest of the combo would play out. The sword popping up behind you only has a set distance. After realizing this, it became a very good opportunity to heal up. This is also one of the few boss fights in the game where I think the arena it is in actually matters. The chairs and tables are arguably stronger than the boss. To avoid the attacks, you need to play a lot with your positioning. And nothing kills you faster than getting caught on something while you backpedal. You need to find moments to clear some space out for yourself, which to me was a refreshing type of challenge that isn't really anywhere else in the game. Beating this boss felt really good. After a while, I found plenty of openings to be aggressive by sneaking in dodge attacks between combos and jump attacks in larger openings. The final moments of this fight was this enjoyable rush, where it just couldn't touch me anymore and I built up the stance break meter in every opening I got. Great stuff. Now that we are slowly approaching the late game of Elden Ring, I think the boss quality picks up. Not just yet though, because we have to get through Golden Boy Godfrey first. It is just a dude with an axe and absolutely no HP. He has no pressure in the fight. The boss has some gap closing attacks, but tends to not really use them all that much. He will just walk towards you menacingly between combos, and watch as you heal back up, if you even need to. So long as you don't get one-shot by his combos and have done some exploring to have a decent amount of healing flasks, then he just has nothing. But the boss afterwards is really good. Morgoth's moveset is a great continuation of Margit's. He still punishes panic rolling, but now he is also zooming around. I hope you've been leveling endurance since you last fought him, because he certainly has. His combos are extremely long, but there's still only a few where you absolutely need to be on the defensive. And also, his stance bar is still surprisingly low. So pure aggression to build up that break is still the way, even if it means trading a hit. You need to stick to him and don't let up the pressure. Just like with Margit, some of his attacks are easier if you are close. In the second phase, he raises his blood-coated sword above himself and will only do a single slash with long recovery if you are close. But if you try to run, then he charges after you with 2 well-timed slashes that can easily roll catch you, and have after effects that make it even harder to dodge this attack. This fight is so good, it's non-stop action. You should be running around as much as possible. There are plenty of openings to heal or punish if you just don't stop moving. His hitboxes are tight, his new attacks enjoyable. Like the one where he makes a bunch of swords rain down and you have to find an easy path to get some punishing attacks in. I think this is a great way of reusing assets. Visually and also lore-wise, you are just fighting the same guy twice. But mechanically, it's very different. Unlike the version outside of Leyndell, which doesn't really add anything as far as I'm concerned. Morgoth is a fantastic fight if you're not overleveled. My only complaint is that I think his HP is a bit low. By the time most people get to Leyndell, he's nothing more than just a slight speed bump. You have to make a beeline for him to have a decent fight. After that, we have the Fire Giant, which is sadly another miss in my book. I think above else, this is a DPS check to make sure that your character and gear is good enough for the last stretch of the game. On my first playthrough, where I was taking my time and exploring as much as possible, it was no issue at all. Only died once. Second playthrough, where I was rushing to the bosses I steamrolled, it was pretty annoying. I really felt the lower damage output here, compared to the other bosses where I could get by just by understanding the mechanics of the fight. There's a surprising amount of jank to this fight which I didn't get to fully appreciate my first time around. It has a rolling attack to reposition and then start shooting fireballs at you from a distance. Not much of an issue. But depending on its position in the arena, it can get caught on something and then just be a continuous rolling hitbox on top of you. If you build up enough stagger, it can fall down and open up the eye for a riposte. But because you're always fighting on uneven ground, I not once managed to actually trigger the riposte. I could also never figure out if I preferred fighting on horseback or on foot. Most attacks didn't need iframes to avoid, the speed of the horse was enough. But if you fall down from the horse, you'd roll around on the floor for a good 3 seconds, and almost always die instantly. But I still did most of the fight with the horse for the simple reason that the camera is zoomed out further. I think the camera was always an issue with the big fights in From Software games. And in Elden Ring it is no different. If you lock on to big enemies like Fire Giant, then the camera zooms out a tiny bit more. But locking on is still a bad idea. Bouncing between the different lock-on points to keep track of all attacks can be pretty dangerous. And if you're under the enemy, then the lock-on camera can easily become a detriment. Fire Giant in particular is awkward because you're chipping at its legs, while almost all telegraphs for the attacks come from its hands. Handling the camera yourself is the much better way to fight. But then the camera also pretends like it's a close quarters battle. The best way to do it would be to zoom out the camera even further and make it independent from the lock-on. Just make it jump back as soon as you are engaged in combat. Games like Neo and Monster Hunter handle the camera in this way, and I find the big fights to be a lot more readable in those games. I used a mod to increase the field of view so that we can get a rough idea what it could look like. Don't get spooked, the game is gonna look like Warframe for a bit. And suddenly, the fight is less of a mess. I can easily keep track of this fireball approaching, while I'm mainly focusing on making my swings connect. But of course, you won't notice any of that if you just have the damage output to get through Fire Giant's huge health bar. Bleed weapons in particular. Not a good boss, I'd say. For the next boss, we sadly got another stinker, the Godskin duo. I don't exactly know how I managed it, but on my first playthrough I didn't die to them. It could be that I'm just very familiar with them, because they are just two bosses you already fought, thrown into the same arena. But I still think it was more luck than skill, as luck can sadly play a big part in any boss fight with multiple enemies. Depending on which attacks they decide to pair up, you could have two wildly different attempts. Here that one enemy just keeps watching as I kill its partner. On a different attempt, it perfectly roll catches me as I dodge the attack of the first enemy. Player skill is still the main deciding factor, but RNG can drastically change how much skill is asked of the player. In my fight against the Godskins, they didn't really cover each other well. I could quickly burst one of them down, while the other just kinda let me do it. Either way, the boss is bad. It is once again more of a DPS check. Rushing one of them down is key to winning the fight. You could turn a fight against two bosses into something closer to 1.5 bosses. Once one of them is down, you have quite a bit of time before it will be resummoned. And while it's getting summoned, you have one of the best openings to deal damage. The first guy could be left at 20% HP at the point where they are a duo again. But of course, that all depends on your gear. The fight could be easier or harder, not because of how well you know the moveset or any challenging mechanics, but because of numbers, and also a fair bit of RNG. Which is true for every fight in the game. But with this being a duo fight, and the specifics of the resummon mechanic, the scale is tipped way harder towards your gear mattering. I enjoy the fights with interesting mechanics a lot more. It is also one of the worst examples of recycled content, and you can't skip it, because it's on the main path. I wouldn't mind if it was cut from the game. The single versions are both pretty decent. This one doesn't really add anything to the game. It is a very obvious reference to Ornstein and Smough from Dark Souls 1. A small and big enemy in an arena with pillars. But their movesets don't really have the same chemistry like ONS did. The Godskins have the same movement speed. Only the big one can sometimes be faster with the rolling attack. Both have a ranged attack. Their attack speeds feel very similar. Both have a thrusting weapon. Splitting them up is just a matter of who is closer to you right now, as they are functionally almost identical. ONS were always designed to be fought together, while the Godskin duo really just feels like two individual bosses where the decision to combine them came afterwards, to increase the runtime of the game. I see the lack of chemistry as an issue with every duo boss in Elden Ring, by the way. I don't think the game has any good ones. There does seem to be some sort of check to make sure that only the enemy closest to you will use their full moveset, while the further one will only contribute a single attack every now and then. It is the most noticeable with the Godskins, but every duo or trio boss seems to have it in some form. This helps to make them bearable, but not good. How well this distance check works is still largely dependent on luck, which makes it seem like this is only a band-aid fix for duo boss fights. I think if you're not going to design a duo fight from the ground up to have two movesets that complement each other without overwhelming the player, then maybe you just shouldn't have duo fights. Something related to the Godskin duo that I also want to talk about is bosses having heal punish attacks in this game. In the case of the two Godskin variants, it's a fireball which they can throw at you in neutral. This punish is directly tied to your heal input. They will always do it when they can. I like it. There are very specific moments when they can't use it. The best example can be found with the Crucible Knights. You heal, they poke. But they only have access to the poke in their sword plus shield moveset. Anytime they two-hand the sword and the shield is on their back, they cannot poke. Those are your openings to heal right in their face. It makes the healing in this game more tactical, because you have to find your openings just like with your attacks. Every boss that has such a heal punish attack also has moments when they can't use it. Yes, even Melania. Having distance is also another great way to heal. If you are outside of the reach which the heal punish would cover, then the boss won't even attempt using it. The heal punishes also work extremely well with the stance break mechanic. If I heal right now, then I might get into a loop where the boss keeps punishing that heal, and it makes me lose all of the pressure I had. So I'm gonna focus up, risk it, and keep pressuring to break the stance, and then heal. It creates tension in the fight, has a risk-reward element, and makes the fights more dynamic. All around, great stuff. Let's go to the next boss, because after that, oh boy, we get to fight this game's version of Guts. I like Malekith. Sticking close to him is the best way to fight him. If you dodge into his attacks instead of backwards, then you have plenty of openings between the combos. This one attack really enforces this strategy. He jumps forward one time with his blade, and smoke emits from it. If you are backpedaling, then he becomes a turning wheel and ends the attack with the really dangerous slashes appearing around his blade. That's bad. If you are close to him, then the blade explodes, and he jumps backwards instead with a very good opening at the end. Quickly run back before you miss something given. He has a few attacks where he keeps himself in the air while shooting at you, so you have to be defensive. But he also has a surprisingly low amount of health. A couple of good openings is all you need. Which is really refreshing coming from the absolute health sponges Godskin Duo and Fire Giant. I think this fight is also amazing at rewarding knowledge of your weapon's moveset. In both phases he's hunched over and stands up on his back legs for the attacks, which can make a lot of your horizontal attacks fly under him. Vertical hits are the better option in almost all cases. Your weapon can drastically change which attacks you should go for in any given situation. You might want to wait a moment after a roll to get a neutral light attack instead of the dodge attack. Jumping light attacks might be preferable to heavies. Two-handing versus one-handing. I really enjoy this about the fight. The only thing I don't like is the Beast Clergyman. Tell me why we always have to go through the first phase if we just want to fight Malekith. I find this moveset very annoying. He is constantly backing up and throwing rocks at you, in an attempt to slow the fight down to a crawl. I honestly think that Malekith has a better back and forth with being aggressive and leaving openings. The beast is just a slog you have to get through. After a while I could finish it pretty quickly, especially if I managed to get one stance break. He has one of the slowest recovery animations in the game. Sometimes you can get 2 fully charged heavy attacks off, which puts him one light attack away from getting his stance broken again with a greatsword. By that point the phase is basically done. But I still wished for a standalone Malekith version. I don't see a lot of gameplay value in the first phase. That might not be the best solution because of story reasons. So maybe just reduced health so we can get to Malekith quicker would be good. Godfrey the First Elden Lord is one of the best boss fights in the game. The moveset is way better than the golden version. He finally starts using some gap closing attacks, so backpedaling isn't quite as effective anymore. The first phase is kinda easy, but still very enjoyable. There are plenty of openings between his axe swings. You can have near constant pressure against him and get multiple stance breaks if you're comfortable with his moveset. You can rush this phase down very quickly, which is great, because the second phase is where the real meat of the fight is. He ditches his axe, the lion on his back, and his clothes, which is quite a tone shift, but I'm all for it. Fighting a wrestler with a ton of grapples and fake outs fits surprisingly well into this game. His entire moveset is made to punish panicking. He will lunge at you, but stay in the air for some time. He also likes to combo this out of his Earthshaker attack, to obscure the startup while there's still debris flying around. He can wind up his arm before a grab like it's a cartoon. On his stomps, he raises his leg all the way to the top, but lingers there for just a moment. His aggressive dodges towards you always look like he's about to rip you apart with his hands, but he can't combo any attack from them. They are just purely intimidation tactics to make you flinch. Learning his moveset was incredibly fun. It really is just all about not getting intimidated by him. The scary grab attacks are actually some of the best openings for damage and working towards the stance break. His roars only knock you back without dealing any damage. Trading a hit with that is very worthwhile, as you can always avoid any attack after that if you delay your get up dodge. His big phase switch move looks like you should be running from it. He screams the entire time and raises his arms in a very slow and steady manner, which communicates get away from the boss. But you only need iframes or jumps for the 2 shockwaves. If you are comfortable in knowing when those are, then you can keep pummeling him. Once again, all about not getting intimidated. This boss is excellent. I have 0 complaints. Great visual design that works with the gameplay of the fight, fantastic animations, soundtrack is a banger, and a bit of cheesy dialogue. Haha tarnished, now I fight in my second phase. It's my favorite main boss. And then right after we get another banger of a boss. Well, half of a banger at least. The Elden Beast is the best boss fight in Elden Ring. The only thing that brings it down a bit is the first, nah I'm kidding, Radagon is the good one. This boss has my favorite type of area of effect attacks in the game, which I usually don't like. But here they are first telegraphed by a golden cone that only deals chip damage, and then comes the explosion. You can easily slip past it and then get a good opening to deal damage. But you still have to be mindful of your positioning while you punish. You don't want to go back into it. I really like the 3 big hammer attacks. The first 2 are too fast to punish, but the third is so delayed that you can get some swings in, dodge it, and then keep punishing. The only thing I don't like are the teleports. I think they should have a minimum distance which the boss always has to travel. Usually they're fine. The boss goes back to shoot some projectiles. But sometimes the teleport doesn't move Radagon at all, which then damages you and limits your options to punish. Other than that, the boss is good. I don't have a lot to say about this one. There isn't a very high focus on your moveset like with Malekith, or any mechanics like Horalu's intimidation tactics. It's a very straightforward fight, and very fun. But there is also that second boss of the fight and the final one of the game, the Elden Beast. I hope you enjoy lots of particles on your screen. I don't think this is a good final boss. It's not all that challenging in my opinion, but very annoying to fight. A lot of its attacks will leave it halfway across the arena, so there is a ton of downtime where you are just chasing after this lava lamp. The most annoying attack it has is the giant glowing ball that spawns multiple projectiles which all track after you. This boss fight, which is already pretty slow, is basically on pause for 20 seconds each time it decides to use this move. It doesn't deal all that much damage except for the final explosion of the ball, but you still need to deal with it for those 20 seconds. I found the most success with running in a circle instead of dodging. While it does put all of your aggression on pause, the same is not true for the Elden Beast, as it can still attack while all of that is happening. And depending on which attack it picks, it can lead to some nasty combinations where you can only lose basically. I think the Elden Beast deserves a nerf. The Elden Stars attack could go into the trash and the fight would be so much better. Still not perfect though. This fight has a lot of awkwardness, and I really wonder if it was originally meant to have horseback combat. A lot of things would make way more sense. The downtime of chasing after the thing wouldn't be an issue. Even if you decide to use standard combat, you could still use the horse to skip the boring part. The Elden Stars attack could probably be outrun with the horse. Maybe you could even circle around the beast and keep hitting it while the ball is chasing you. Jumping over these rings could be more fun with the better aerial control of the horse. Same with those slashes, could probably jump over them. And we also have the issue of the camera again. On foot, you can often be so close to the beast that it's honestly hard to follow what's even happening in the fight. While I am overall not the biggest fan of horseback combat, I do think it would lead to a better experience with this fight. The fight would be a lot easier, but I think that's good in this case. Radagon is the real final boss with a decent amount of challenge, and Elden Beast is just a victory lap with good visuals and lots of story implications to let you wind down. Think of the secret ending of Bloodborne. Would fit with the spectacle of the fight and also the music. I think Elden Beast has one of the best and also most majestic OSTs in the game, which feels out of place because the gameplay is so aggravating. The Elden Beast part brings this final boss down quite a bit. I thought Radagon was a pretty good way of ending the game. It has this amazing version of the main theme playing, and all the hammering attacks as a callback to that first teaser trailer we saw a few years back. They could have left it at that without a second fight. Maybe increase Radagon's health to compensate. As it is, I think most other modern From Software games had better final boss fights. But we still have a couple of late game optional boss fights to talk about, and there are quite a few really good ones. Like Moog, the Lord of Blood. At 3 points in the fight he will teach you how to count. In those moments you can position yourself out of the way of the spear, and then use your highest damage combos. I think unlike the Godskin duo, here the DPS check works. There's no threat of having to deal with 2 bosses if you're not running a maximum DPS build. The fight will just be longer. Some moments where you can just let it rip can be pretty fun. The first phase is pretty tame. After bringing him below 50% of his health, and if he has already gone through Tres, Duo and Unos by that point, then he starts screaming while draining your blood and frying my PC. It is definitely a bit of an unusual decision to have guaranteed unavoidable damage in a boss fight, unless you're using a specific item for it. Can't think of a case where they've ever done that before. But in this specific case, I like it. I think the number of available flasks can be a bit too high for a lot of bosses, if you've been exploring. So the flask tags forced me to pay more attention to the moveset, because I couldn't just out-heal my way through the fight. For example, on my first playthrough I beat Morgoth first try, and I played like absolute trash. I don't think there was a single new attack that I dodged correctly, but he just couldn't burn through my army of flasks. With Moog, the first phase is also pretty easy after a while. I had many attempts where I could rush it down super fast and only needed healing for the second. This is where the fight becomes really messy, with all the bloodfire area denial attacks. You have to mind your positioning to fight in clear spaces, and you can also manipulate some of his blood attacks, like the straight shot, with your own positioning. Be close to existing pools of blood when he launches it, so that it doesn't cut a line through your clear spaces. You need to think a few steps ahead to not let the fight get out of hand, which was a really fun challenge on top of dodging his attacks. His moveset has a great variety of attacks. Blood waves where you should dodge into them, straight shots so you dodge to the side, blood rain from above so you dodge backwards, but you can also be greedy and sneak a few attacks in before it starts. Claw attacks where it's very easy to panic by dodging the slashes in the air, which are purely visual, instead of the following actually damaging explosion. The spear is very high damaging, but you can also find several safe spots on his left side to be under the swipe attacks. Lots of sprinting helps to get into the safe spots and to avoid the bloody fire. I also think the knee heal counting with the music change is really cool. Very good boss. Once again, 0 complaints. We also have the Regal Ancestor Spirit. I think this is a good example of an easy boss that still manages to be fun. It can't be interrupted like Renala, so you can appreciate the moveset. It also doesn't have the awkwardness of Radahn. The attacks seem well matched to its size. The boss can spit mist, which deals a lot of damage, but the arena is big enough so you can always move out of it. The sound effect is really cute. I like the jump attack where it will keep itself in the air 2 times to trick you into dodging early, but then comes down on the third one. Throughout the fight it can absorb the energy from the spirit animals inside the arena, to heal itself and also gain new attacks that those animals use, like the rolling attack of the sheep. It's nice, and brings some variety into the moveset. Overall, it's just a really pleasant fight with good music. It's like Studio Ghibli made this one. Rykard is my favorite version of a Stormruler fight they've ever done. It's not pathetically easy. The boss can still overwhelm you with all the skulls flying at you, but you can also stagger him very easily. It's alright. I think Placidusax doesn't really have a lot going for it besides amazing visuals. It's a very typical dragon fight. It's too big to always hit you, so for most of the fight you can empty your stamina bar on it. It's not attacking very fast, so you have plenty of time to heal up. The teleporting flying attack looks really good, but it also leaves it very far away from you, so there's lots of running. Same with the smaller teleports it can do. The boss is fine. Sometimes you just want to hit a cool looking dragon in a pretty arena. And then of course we have Melania. She is the Blade of Miquella, and will keep reminding you about that. Here's the thing about Melania. Is she difficult? Absolutely. Is she fair? For the most part, yes. But there's a difference between being fair and fun. And to me, the most important question is, do I think she's actually fun to fight? Yes, it's my favorite fight in Elden Ring. She has lifesteal on her attacks, which forces you to really learn the moveset if you want to make any progress in the fight. She really punishes careless healing with her thrust attack. You have to find openings where she can't do it. Typically, the ones that would allow for a jump attack are good, kinda like the Crucible Knights. You should never heal when she is in neutral, unless you already have a lot of distance. Her moveset is incredibly oppressive. Your dodges need to be very precise to avoid her attacks. She has that one move. You probably know the one I'm talking about. Has a very distinct telegraph, consists of 3 parts followed by one last hit, and she always seems to hit you no matter how you time your dodge. Sparks come from her right arm and she jumps forward with 3 slashes, and then another. That final slash seems to perfectly catch you outside of your iframes each time. It felt like it was just guaranteed healing every time she decided to use this one attack. The trick is to not dodge backwards for this one. Always dodge to her left or right side, so that you'll be out of reach for the last slash. Her tracking is very limited on that one. In her second phase, she can inflict Scarlet Rot with her attacks, and she starts chaining her attacks more rapidly. She has a new move where she flies up and sends clones after you. This is the second hardest attack to dodge in Elden Ring. Here's how I had the most success dodging it. The first thing you need is distance. The second thing is alternating your dodge direction between left and right, starting with a left dodge. First you run, as soon as you recognize this attack. She crouches down and waves of Scarlet Rot form around her, which is a different startup compared to the other flying attacks. For the first 2 clones, it can be worthwhile to do diagonal dodges backwards to cover a bit more ground. The more distance you have, the easier it's going to be to time your dodges. The next 3 clones come in rapid succession. Stop going for distance and only dodge left, right, left. No more diagonals. Melania herself is a tiny bit delayed and deals the most damage by far. So once the clones are gone, hold just a moment and then do a final dodge. The quick version is this. Run, diagonal left, diagonal right, left, wait, right. What's also essential is that you keep calm. If you start panicking, then your rhythm can quickly spiral out of control, and you start eating every hit. All of this sounds pretty overwhelming, like you should play reactive against this boss and only punish in the few safe openings she gives you. No, you go in and you beat the shit out of her. She has incredibly low poise, which is what makes this fight excellent. Her staggers are very consistent. After trying to beat her for an hour, I've gotten to the point where I could delay my attacks to always catch her outside of her hyper armor, which was the most satisfying feeling of mastery any Elden Ring boss has given me. She kicks, dodge attack to interrupt the start of her follow-up, circling around me, delay the attack chain to catch her behind me. The really slow attack, keep smacking her, dodge twice, and then a charged attack because the recovery is huge. Gaining distance, I'm not done with you, come back. This is so much fun. I was no longer waiting for my turns to attack. You cannot meet Melania on her own terms. If she starts styling on you with endless combos in her second phase, then you absolutely need to attack. Doesn't matter if it's a trait. Force her to react to the stagger so that you gain back control over the fight. Melania is only as aggressive as you allow her to be. So, don't. But let's talk about Waterfowl Dance for real this time. I wasn't really concerned about her healing like I was with the 3 slashes. The only thing I cared about was Waterfowl Dance not ending my run. This is the most difficult attack From Software has ever designed. And I do think it actually goes a bit too far. Which I'll get to. But first I'll list all the ways of avoiding it I know, so that we are on the same page. The easiest is Bloodhound Step. It has iframes, it has distance. Exactly what you need for this attack. You can be fancy by pressing the button in response to her attacks. But just spamming the button as soon as it starts is enough. By the time the second part comes out, you are halfway up the Halig tree. You can equip the Ash of War on a dagger and then swap to it, if you'd still like to keep your main weapon Ash. Second option, shields. She will heal off your block, but the main thing is surviving this attack. Anything with lots of stability, like a great shield, or a medium with the barricade Ash of War, works great. I'd suggest only blocking the first flurry, because the rest can be dodged, and then you won't heal the boss as much. There is also the Ash of War called Vow of the Indomitable. It makes you completely invincible during the animation, which is long enough to avoid everything. But the timing is pretty tight. I'd suggest one of the other methods. You can throw a freezing pot at her. I'm not kidding, it works. Her freeze resistance is really low. One pot will always trigger a frost status effect, which comes with a stagger animation. I suggest putting the freeze pot in your pouch slot. The throw animation isn't all that fast. And it can be quite a close call if you have to go through your quick bar first. The frost status effect lowers the enemy's resistances. You can see it's active with these icy clouds. But what's worth knowing is that you can't trigger frost again while the effect is still going. So no waterfall dance stagger. Simple enough, all she needs is fire-based damage to warm up. This is probably the funniest way of dealing with this attack, and she honestly deserves it.
And I have never known
Now we get to strategies that don't require specific items or tools, just the base actions any player has access to. The better one is to just run away. You can outrun the first part, then dodge into the second, and away from the third. But this is where we come to an issue with Waterfall Dance. You absolutely need a head start for outrunning to be possible. If she catches you in a bad moment, like when you're in the recovery of an attack, then you simply don't have the distance for running to be a safe option. You will take damage. This can turn the fight into a bit of a gamble. There seems to be some internal cooldown on this attack, where she won't be able to use it again for 30 seconds or so. But even if the cooldown is over, it doesn't mean that she will use it right this instant. It only means that she could use it again. So you still have to play in fear that it could catch you in a bad moment, which promotes passive play, that feels out of place when the rest of her moveset promotes aggression so well. And in her second phase, I honestly believe that the cooldown is just gone. I can't see any pattern for when she can do it. It seems to just be shuffled in with all her other moves. So is there nothing you can do when she catches you inside your recovery? I'll show you something, and then go through it step by step. So you break the lock on and then break her ankles. Give her the old razzle dazzle. While you're running around her, watch her feet closely. Shouldn't be much of an issue for some of you gamers. Look for the moment when she snaps into the attack. You want to dodge twice into the opposite direction of what she picks. Apply the lock on again. It can help for the last part. Dodge through the second flurry. Walk, not run, towards her first and then southeast to make her tracking completely miss you. Simple, right? How did I not think of this? Yeah, I don't think this is it. Props to whoever figured this out. You're a mad lad. But I think in terms of figuring this out yourself and actually executing the strat, this is so far beyond anything in the game. In my attempt to get footage of me doing it without taking a single bit of damage, I beat Miscellaneous 11 times. The fight itself is much easier than this strategy. I would still suggest for everyone to do this strat, as even a bad execution of it can prevent a ton of damage. When you're caught in a bad moment, you might as well. But I don't think this strategy existing makes Waterfall Dance acceptable. I think it needs a nerf, but not a big one. The strategy of running away for the first flurry is reasonable, in my opinion. The player can quickly understand that iframes are not enough for it. There are too many hitboxes. So being outside of this flurry's reach seems like the logical next step. Ring around the rosy does not seem logical to me. The nerf to Waterfall Dance I would like is that Miscellaneous telegraphs the attack just a little bit longer. Probably not even a full second longer. Gives you enough time so you can always get the proper distance before it comes out. And weapons with longer recovery aren't getting screwed over anymore. There's also something else this would prevent. There exists this weird mid-range distance with Waterfall Dance, where you are basically too close to outrun the first part, but also too far away to get to her and make a tracking miss. And I can't think of anything to do in that situation. You need Bloodhound Step, a shield, freeze pots, or spells. If someone has something, I'd love to hear it in the comment section. A slightly longer startup of the attack would remove this mid-range. You'd have enough time to pick one of the two strategies. And that's all that's needed to make Waterfall Dance a good attack, I'd say. For the rest of the fight, I can only really think of one more change I'd like. She shouldn't be able to heal against your shield. I am very much on board with the lifesteal mechanic. It really forces you to learn the moveset, which is great for an optional super boss. But from a gameplay standpoint, I think she should only be able to heal when you make a mistake. And blocking is just not a mistake. Messing up your stamina management and getting guard broken, that's a mistake. Which is already getting punished by her, and any enemy or boss in the game really. There's one last thing, which I've initially seen as an issue with her, but I've changed my mind about it after further testing. Miscellaneous can cancel her stagger animation. Either she dodges out of it and covers a lot of distance, or she deflects out of the stagger and does a counterattack. In the second phase, she can even do her kick attack out of staggers. I now see it as a necessary evil for a human fight with low poise. I think there's a lot of value in a boss fight against a fast and aggressive enemy where you can interrupt their attacks. But we need to bend the rules a bit to make them challenging. Otherwise, we have something like Renala or Sir Gideon the Deceased. It's very easy to find strategies that completely force their hand. For example, chaining running attacks. Any decently fast weapon type with more stagger than a dagger can do it. And even those can do it with heavy running attacks, but it is harder to execute. If they attack, they get staggered. If they dodge back, they get caught at the end of their roll. You basically put them in checkmate. If he is so all-knowing, then why doesn't he know that you need poise to cast spells?
We continue to struggle.
Imagine if this worked on Miscellaneous. The in my opinion hardest boss fight From Software has ever made would be downgraded to a basic NPC invader. Miscellaneous stagger cancels allow her to gain some breathing room and to retaliate. What I've initially seen as an issue was that second cancel with the deflect. The deflect makes one-handed or power stance weapons bounce, just like hitting a shield would. But she actually doesn't have any fast enough follow-ups that would punish your bounce animation. You can always dodge them unless you button mash and commit to a second attack after the deflect. Don't do that and it's perfectly fine. Same goes for the kick in her second phase. Only commit to the next attack once you see what she does. If it's the kick, you dodge it and then punish her before she can chain into her next move. But then, what about slower weapons with lots of recovery? Those will get screwed, right? No. The game has light and heavy stagger animations, and Miscellaneous cannot cancel out of the heavy staggers which those weapons inflict. She has to fully play out the animation before she can go into one of her counters, so there's no guaranteed punish here either. It's pretty well designed, I'd say.
Strength. Extraordinary.
I'm not claiming that any of this is easy, by the way. It's not. Miscellaneous is brutal. I was stuck on her for 3 hours before I got my first kill. By the end, I still didn't know how to dodge waterfall dance up close, and tried to always run for distance. But what makes her my favorite fight in the game is that there are so many mechanics to understand and dig into. Coming back to her and repeatedly beating her still taught me new things about the fight. And I think, except for waterfall dance starting a bit too fast and her healing against shields, all of her mechanics are pretty fair. It's an amazing tug of war where both of you are trying to get the upper hand and forcing the opponent to play reactive. Either she sends you running away trying to look for safe openings, or you keep chaining your attacks and slapping every attempt at retaliation away. It's ridiculous how good this fight is. I can't think of another boss where I had a complete change of mind like this. From first thinking, this is legitimately unfair and unbalanced, to then thinking, this is the most fun I've had in this game. Boss fights like Miscellaneous, Warrior, Moog, Malekith and Morgoth really carry the overall boss quality for me. I need more. As I said near the start of the video, I think Elden Ring has some really great fundamental combat mechanics with the stance breaks encouraging aggression. And what does the game do with it? For the most part, it's spectacle fights, gimmick fights and spectacle fights with gimmicks. I don't think that's playing to the strengths of this game's mechanics, which is why I'd rate the overall quality as average, despite the game having some of the best boss fights I've ever seen. But I'd much rather take an average quality that is made up of extremes, instead of everything just kinda being mediocre. Elden Ring has some boss fights which are now among my favorites of all time. Now that we are approaching the end of the video, I have some more miscellaneous topics to talk about. Something which I absolutely need to mention is the performance of Elden Ring and the launch day. For context, I've always played these games at launch, starting from Dark Souls 2. So DS2, 3, Bloodborne, Sekiro and Elden Ring. And Elden Ring had the worst launch day by far. The performance seemed to be completely random. Some people with worse setups had much better performance. It was like the game just threw dice when it first saw your setup. And the game settings basically did nothing for the performance. This isn't what I meant when I asked for Bloodborne on PC. On top of that, you had to force the game to actually utilize the graphics card. Multiplayer was basically unplayable for the first few weeks, because of server issues. For this one, I don't really blame them. I don't think they could have anticipated such a high player count. Enemies could be completely invisible, which is one issue I luckily didn't have. There would just be a floating lock-on point attacking you. What I did have was incredibly long input delays. For some reason, the charged attacks had it the worst, where I could sometimes press the button for 2 full seconds and spin my character in a circle, before the game registered it. But all inputs had it to a lesser degree. Fighting Margit like that was extra funny. There were stutters everywhere, most notable when an enemy had a new effect I haven't seen before. So it was most likely a shader cache issue, as if this is an emulated game. For some enemies like the Tree Sentinel, the stutters never went away until a patch came out. There were many crashes. But the post-launch patches made a decent improvement. The worst problems are fixed. Stutters and input delays are pretty much gone. And the performance is acceptable in my opinion. I think the game could have used another delay. The release was pretty tarnished. Next up is the co-op in Elden Ring. I like it. Going through the legacy dungeons again and sharing all the secrets we found was a great time. They finally seem to have found a decent sweet spot for the balancing. In previous games, the health scaling never seemed to stand a chance against the damage output of your co-op partners. But in Elden Ring, some fights can be even harder in co-op. Typically, the ones that already have an impressive health bar. With the extra scaling for multiplayer, they feel like fighting a raid boss with your friends. What seems to be completely new this time around is that bosses can swap aggression between different swings of their combo, which is amazing. Here, the downward slash goes for one of the summons, and then the stab at the end targets the host. Even when the boss is not targeting you, you still have to be on your guard in case the aggression swaps. It really helps to make the co-op fights more engaging. Although it still often feels like only one person at a time is fighting the boss, while the rest can practice their maximum DPS combos. At its core, I think the fights are designed around one-on-one combat. The majority of movesets don't really have an answer for several opponents hitting the boss, outside of the occasional AoE attack. It's not like Monster Hunter, which is primarily a co-op game, and so boss movesets are designed to fight off multiple hunters at once. Elden Ring is primarily single player, I'd say, and with that in mind, the co-op is pretty damn good. The mid-combo target switching alone makes this my favorite co-op combat in any From Software game. As far as actual cooperation in a fight goes, Elden Ring is also the best with its field bosses. Wanna know what my favorite dragon fight in the game was? It was Agil, right outside the tutorial. Doing it low level in co-op was so much fun. Way more than chipping at its toes solo. Once the dragon was open for a riposte, we gave quick callouts to determine who should get it. The Dragonfire attack can be outrun, but the turn radius is pretty tight. If we both run in the same direction, then the person that's slightly behind will be caught in the fire. So once we saw the attack start, we gave callouts to split, so that one person can charge straight at the dragon while the other deals with the fire. The co-op fights are really fun, but the open world still rears its ugly head. You can't use the horse online, which I like for the open world fights like dragons. But the open world exploration is basically killed by this. Nobody wants to actually run through areas in an open world. So for large parts of the co-op experience, we are alone on our horse getting items for our characters. It often didn't seem worth summoning the other players if you just need to rush somewhere to grab an item. Especially since all areas like the dungeons and the different zones of the world are separated by a fog gate. It mostly felt like playing a single player game while hanging out in a call. Outside of the legacy dungeons, which were once again the best parts. I think this makes the other games the better overall co-op experience. It's a full playthrough with non-stop online funnies. The linear structure of those games made the fog gate separation of areas a non-issue basically. Please fix the servers once Elden Ring is in a good state. I wonder if there would be some kind of way of making the horse work online. It would be a buggy mess with lots of rubber banding, I'm sure, but I think I would like it. Once an invader is present, it should get disabled though. It already works like that with NPC invaders. PvP horseback combat sounds kinda fun at first, but it would probably be so incredibly unbalanced. The horse doesn't have iframes, and so I imagine that any form of spellcasters would just get an instant win over melee players. Just run back and spray them whenever they get close. What are they gonna do about it? Get on and off from the horse? God knows the PvP already has enough balancing issues. This might be a surprise, but I am actually into the PvP in From Software games. Despite all the flaws like phantom range, I still enjoy fighting other players with a build I came up with. And I gotta say, this PvP is pretty fun, but it could be better. Originally, I thought the PvP in this game was terrible. In my notes, I called it the most dysfunctional PvP system they've had since Dark Souls 1's instant backstabs. But then came the 1.04 update, which fixed so many exploits and broken strategies that I'm now a lot more positive on the PvP. Colossal swords are now faster. Some exploits like the Carrion Retaliation self-cast are gone. The stagger of status effects is reduced, which is one of the worst parts of the PvP. A bunch of useless or completely outclassed spells got buffed, so casters now use more than the top 2 or 3 spells. The update was fantastic, but there is still a long way to go. Status effects build up during the iframes of your dodge roll, which was also a thing in previous games, and it wasn't that big of a deal. Just make sure that you're inside iframes when the status effect triggers, and you won't take any damage. But now in Elden Ring, the status effects Bleed, Frost, Frenzy and Sleep all have some form of stun or stagger animation, which will still play out if you dodge the status effect trigger, which means you will get hit. The update has reduced this issue by making the stagger animations shorter. Bleed and Frost staggers are okay now, I'd say, but the Frenzy and Sleep animations are still too long. I really want to hammer this home. You could be perfectly dodging your opponent, but still eventually take guaranteed damage because they can punish that stagger. That's dumb. I wish they could just tie the status build up to the damage instance, so that you can dodge through them both. Status effects having staggers would probably be fine then. One status effect in particular is not fine, regardless of staggers. Bleed. You can delete an opponent in less than a second with the amount of damage it deals. It is extremely disgusting on multi-hit weapons like twin blades and dual curved swords, or something fast with long reach like power stancing cross naginatas. If you also stack poise with that, then you can just stand in their face and wait for any animation of theirs to come out. Once you see them flinch in any way, press attack. GG. Even after the nerf, the fingerprint shield is still stupidly overpowered. Those were some of the major issues I see with the PvP, but I am hopeful, because I can't remember previous games ever receiving such a big balance wave like the 1.04 update. A few more of those and there might be something really good in there. The keyword is might. Compared to previous games, most things deal an absurd amount of damage, with one-shots being very easy to achieve. And our survivability barely increased, if at all. So the fights have less back and forth. Most often, one mistake on either side is all that's needed to end a fight. But the fundamentals of Elden Ring PvP are actually pretty fun in my opinion, especially with the jump button. You can figure out which attacks of your opponent you can hop over and instantly punish with a jump attack, which is also a great roll catching tool because you can delay the attack mid-air to throw off their timing. Now I don't think the PvP will ever be truly balanced like some serious esport game, and it also shouldn't be. PvP in these games was always a bit of goofy fun, invasions in particular. I think Elden Ring invasions can be some of the funniest in all From Software games. There are some amazing tools to be a nuisance, like the Cannon of Hammer spell, which is basically a magic mortar shell that you can arc over things. Using the Concealing Veil talisman that makes you invisible while crouched past a certain range. Especially funny if you combine that with explosive ammunition in any place where gravity could kill you. Or using the Ashes of War like gravitas to pull people into holes. Funniest shit I've ever seen. One thing I am missing in invasions are the covenants of previous games. In Elden Ring multiplayer, you can only be invaded by red phantoms and call the police on them. Dark Souls 3, for example, had the purple Mount Makers, which was my favorite covenant. Your objective was to either kill the host or a set number of players on either side. Fights usually played out like this. You were fighting alongside the reds to kill the host, but as soon as your side is losing, you'd switch and target the reds instead. You are the wildcard. There were some incredibly funny mind games where you were playing nice with your gestures and block spamming to convince the reds that you didn't mean to hit them, they just walked into your attack. But as soon as they have their back turned, you throw another at them. Sometimes the host and invaders would put their differences aside and focus you down first, because nobody wants to deal with your bullshit. Mount makers were so funny. I think the idea and design was really smart. Gaining the trust of rats was actually possible, because realistically, killing the host is the easier way of achieving your goal. It is only one kill instead of multiple. So maybe you are just a regular invader that only happens to play the Purple Covenant because you want to get the final spell off it. A system like that, with the open world field bosses of Elden Ring, that could have been amazing. I don't know how much longevity Elden Ring's multiplayer will have without Covenants. The spell and weapon rewards from Covenants ensured that there was always a new influx of players willing to at least try out the PvP. In Elden Ring, the invaders will get rune arcs for killing the host, which is kinda whatever, because only the host in multiplayer can use those. Both sides will get runes for killing the other players, but most people that PvP already committed to a specific level range. And if you do still need runes, then there are much better farming spots in the game. The only people that invade in Elden Ring are the ones that do it for the fun of it, which I suspect will slow the multiplayer down quite a bit over time, despite the game having the highest player count by far. Would be nice if an update or future DLC could expand some of the multiplayer options. So that's pretty much all I wanted to say about Elden Ring. I know I trashed the open world a lot, and it may seem like I just hate open world games or something. And that's correct. I take a more linear game with tighter design, more focus on quality over quantity, and better balancing any day. Though to be serious for a second, there are open world games where I actually enjoyed the open world aspect of them. I just don't think going open world is necessarily superior for the From Software games. But I'm fine with them experimenting with the formula. That's what got us Bloodborne after all. With a few key changes, the next open world could be pretty good. Make the world about 30% smaller, so that you can spend the necessary time on all areas, boss fights, and to also have less filler content in the game. I get that they wanted to make an impressive world, but I don't get why they went so overboard with it and tried to double the amount of playtime compared to previous games. With the right implementation, I think recycled content could also be very good for the game. I personally was hoping to find some kind of place where you can refight all bosses as much as you want, like a forever ever jail. Give it a lore explanation and a space in the world. And then refighting bosses at your own will would feel less out of place compared to randomly stumbling upon a recycled major boss fight somewhere in the open world. Maybe throw in a mechanic to repopulate the world to address the balancing issues as well. With changes like that, even I could enjoy an open world. But going forward with their previous world design, plus some Elden Ring mechanics like the jump button and stance breaks, would still be preferable to me. Elden Ring's issues still don't ruin the game for me, not by a long shot. All From Software games have weak parts. I'd still put Elden Ring very high on my ranking of them. Miscellaneous is an S-tier fight, and Leyndell is among my favorite areas in all games. I still believe that. The combat mechanics are some of the best they've ever made, which means to me that even a mechanically uninteresting fight can still be somewhat fun. A boss of similar quality in a game with worse mechanics would hurt the overall experience more. How high exactly I'd rank Elden Ring remains to be seen. These games always gain so much on repeated playthroughs for me, and letting some time pass. Bloodborne didn't start out as my favorite. I thought Dark Souls 1 was better at first. All I can say for now is that I like it more than Scholar of the First Sin. Thank you for watching. I hope it was entertaining, and consider subscribing if you want to see more. My next video is going to be on Neo 2. I hope you enjoy combat and boss fights just as much as I do, because that game has nothing else, and it is the best game I've played in years. Until then, goodbye.